Evening and welcome to the Psychedelic Association of Canada webinar, The Evolution of Psychedelic Clinics in Canada. My name is Jay Katz, and I am the Executive Director of the Psychedelic Association of Canada. It's great to have you with us tonight. This webinar tonight is part of our Industry Present series and is sponsored by Atma Journey Centers. And we're lucky to have with us Vu Tran, the CEO of Atma. We have Reverdy Darda, the CEO of Sina Life, and Mark Hayden, who's the clinical supervisor of psychedelic therapy at She Integrated Health. And so we have experts from Vancouver, Calgary, and Edmonton with us tonight. For those of you who aren't familiar with the PAC, as we call it, the Psychedelic Association of Canada, we are a national education organization whose goal is to get legal access to psychedelic medicines for all Canadians. And so we provide educational events like this to our public and to our members. We provide education in the psychedelic space for harm reduction and advancement of best practices and best ethical protocols. And we educate lawmakers and government officials, since they'll need to have all the right information to change laws and put the right laws into place. I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves because they can do a much better job of telling you what they're up to than I can do. And we'll start with the first person at the top of my screen, Vu Tran, who is the CEO of Atma Journey Centers. Welcome, Vu. Can you please tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Jay. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Vu Tran. I've been the founder and CEO of Atma Journey. We're 3 years into opening now. I've been sitting with plant medicine for the better part of eight of the past years of my life, and it's really helped me to become a much better person, how to have a better conversation with people, how to have better relationship, how to reconcile a tumultuous past. So I kind of fell in love with plant medicine. And then 3 years ago, I really found out about psychedelic assisted therapy. And I knew that this was the field that was really aligned with the work that I was doing in this portion of this segment of my life as I head into my 50s. And it's been challenging the first couple years, but I feel like we're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm hoping to be here when we cross the line and to be able to make this accessible to as many Canadians as we can.
Thank you, Vu. Next on my screen is Reverdy Darda, the CEO of Sina Life.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. So my name is Reverdy. I am the CEO and founder of Sina Life. It is a mental health service company based in Edmonton. My background is a registered professional. I'm a registered nurse, and I've spent the better part of my entire career in healthcare in Alberta. About 2.5 years ago, after COVID, is when I took the opportunity to leave that career that I had learned so much in and about, and step into the community, realizing there was really a gap in the ability to bring innovation to mental health services, and a lot of evidence over many years that supported that. So in founding Sina Life, which is bridging science and nature, that's the concept. I've had the opportunity to not only learn in the last 2 years, specifically around offering ketamine-assisted therapy, but being able to support and increase access to the opportunity for those that are in most need, special access programs. So in regards to psilocybin-assisted therapy, hoping to get early approval from some of the applications for MDMA-assisted therapy that have been submitted as well. But I'm really excited to be here to share a little bit of what I know and have learned over my course of my career in healthcare, and how I'm applying that in this world of psychedelic drug treatment service.
Oh, thank you, Reverdy. And the third panelist on our panel, Mark Hayden from the Harry Potter Library in beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia. Mark, what can you tell us about yourself?
Well, it's interesting, Jay. As I'm thinking about this conversation we're about to have, we are about to discuss the clinic dance. And I have been doing that dance throughout my entire career, and it sort of mirrors the discussion we're about to have. My first career was I ran a team of therapists in the addictions world for Vancouver Coastal Health. I left that to start MAPS Canada and got involved with psychedelic research that I did for 10 years. And then through a slightly convoluted way, which had some academic tangents, I wound up back into running a clinic, which is fascinating. And I'm running a psychedelic psychotherapy clinic that is primarily ketamine, actually. And so it feels like I've gone through the traditional treatment research component and then back into an alternate health clinic that supports psychedelic psychotherapy.
And welcome to today at the end of that long and fantastic winding journey.
Thank
as
you.
you can
It's a
tell,
pleasure to be here, Jay.
Well, it's a pleasure to share your pleasure with you, Mark. And let's not go any further down that road. As you can see, we have a very accomplished and diverse panel of experts in clinical psychedelic assisted therapy. The laws are starting to change, awareness is starting to change, demand is starting to change. Psychedelics went from being something that a few people knew about to being a stigmatized illegal drug to now swinging back on the pendulum. And that's a complicated environment. It differs by venue, the city or the province that you're in. And there are a lot of people in the psychedelic space and in the healthcare space who are interested in offering these very effective medicines to their patients. And we've come to help people find out what has gone on, what's going on, and what does the future look like for psychedelic clinics in Canada. And so we will likely have time for questions at the end of the talk tonight. You'll see at the bottom of your little Zoom box there's someplace to put your chat and someplace to put your questions. Can you please put your questions in the box that says Q&A, because it's easier for me to find them than if you put them in the chat. If you put them in the chat, I can find them, but it's harder for me because it's woven in with your other comments. But if you put it into Q&A, then I can find your questions much more easily. So thank you, esteemed panel members, for joining us, and thank you, everybody out there watching. The first question that I think we're going to ask is for Reverdy, who's from Sina Life. And Sina Life is engaged in clinical psychedelic assisted therapy now and is legally doing so, even though there actually aren't any licenses available. And that just demonstrates the complicated nature of the law and the fact that these laws are new and still being put in place and differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So, Reverdy, I'm wondering if you could just explain, how does Sina's licensing work? What license does it have? How is it legally participating? Because it's complicated and hard to understand.
For sure. Thanks so much, Jay. I don't know how I got in a position. Well, I should say that Alberta, historically as a province in Canada, often takes initiative, specifically in healthcare, to step ahead, sometimes with good foresight and sometimes just quickly. I'll say it in that context, in my experience. Specifically around psychedelic drug treatment services, Alberta, back in October of 2022, announced a change to the Mental Health Service Protection Act. This effectively brought psychedelic drug treatment under a legislative framework here in Alberta. So this is a provincial jurisdiction, and it's moved forward since that time, and I'll explain a little bit about that. As I alluded in my introduction, I've been in business for 2 years. So just as I was getting going, all of a sudden, the landscape changed for me. Based on that, the ministry reached out to those who were, I would say, in the field of offering psychedelic assisted therapy, and identified that there would be a requirement to submit its application by a certain deadline to be able to ensure, number one, there was awareness about the providers that were doing this service in the province, but number two, that we would comply with emerging service standards. So all of this was very gray and very unknown at the time. It began a cascade of events, and it led to notice that you had to be submitting an application, creating compliance. That's the first step in a many kind of step process. And then in February 2023, it published and distributed service standards for psychedelic drug treatment. Those things require a lot of moving parts to be in place for your clinic. It also requires the members of your clinic to be regulated or licensed. So to have a regulated professional, whether that's a psychologist, an RN, an NP, a social worker, a psychiatrist. So those things became very clear that you must have those in place and that you must have submitted your application for licensing. So as you go forward, you have to demonstrate that you have licensed providers in your clinic and you're working closely with the ministry on the application components and to meet the service standards. So just about a month ago, the ministry sent out an update to all of those who had applied to the license to say it is now prepared and ready to come in to do inspections. So they are organizing and pulling together the information that was submitted. They are reaching out to those that have, and they've openly said there's lots of things that still need to be collected as they've reviewed the information from the applications. I feel, I would say, a little bit blessed because of my past career to have really good relationships and connections. So I feel comfortable reaching out at any time to the ministry to ask a little bit about timelines, what does that require, and where are we in the standing to be able to have somebody come to the clinic, not only to validate the information that has been submitted, but then to support us along the way. So that's what we can expect here in Alberta, and I can expect. So I do have licensed providers in my clinic. So I'm a licensed clinic in that way. I have an active application into the ministry. In that, I speak on a regular basis with the ministry and identifying as I move towards their opportunity to come out and do an inspection, that I would have all those requirements in place. Right now, there's a handful of them. They are not super complicated, but as we go into our discussion today, I'll share a bit more about the other piece that's required here in Alberta, and that's actually accreditation. So that's with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta. But really, those two things became, as Mark said earlier, a complicating factor in being able to set up and provide access to those who were looking for psychedelic drug treatment service.
And so it is very complicated. You are legally offering therapy with licensed therapists and are about to be have compliance inspection to make sure you're up to standards, at which point your application, if and when you're up to standards, will be approved, and you'll actually have the license. At the moment, no one has a license, so there's a small number of you who are permitted to legally continue on in therapy, and when you pass your inspections, you'll be licensed.
Correct. And I just want to be clear, I don't in any way intend to speak or say something that is incorrect. And I do not have an ID number for under the Mental Health Service Protections Act, a license ID number. I do not have that. But I am working towards and continuing to provide access to those services under the framework that Alberta instituted back in 2022.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, just to reflect on everything Reverdy has just said, is Canada as a country controls drugs through the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, so the CDSA. And so that has a broad level, either criminalization or allowing them to be prescribed generally. But then what happens in Canada is provinces are responsible for health dollars. So, and they're all different. So everything that Reverdy just described is actually not true in the province of British Columbia. So we have a different set of rules. And to be honest with you, Alberta's ahead of us. We don't have that structure to provide a psychedelic clinic. We aren't prevented from doing it, and that's why I work at a clinic and provide psychedelic services, but it doesn't have sort of provincial level authority. We have other levels of authority, but the province hasn't stepped up and said, we need it to look this way for it to happen in this province. Now, I think there's a pro and a con. You know, the absence of communication from the province essentially means we're going to do what the CDSA and the College of Physicians and Surgeons allows us to do. There's no other regulatory body with us. And Reverdy is responding to a provincial regulatory body's comments that actually don't exist in this province.
Well, and as Roberti said, Alberta's often the first and is so far the only one. And Mark, your comment leads perfectly and elegantly, thank you so very much, into our next question, which is for you and Roberti. What exactly is the history of psychedelic clinics, psychedelic assisted therapy clinics in Canada, and what is the landscape now currently in Alberta and BC and the other provinces?
Well, let me kick that off first, and then I'll bounce it over to Roberti. So, as you know, psychedelics are a new phenomenon in terms of their legal availability. So the front runner has been ketamine legally, but that hasn't driven the discussion. The discussion has been driven in the media throughout North America, Canada, and the United States by the excitement of researchers around primarily, I would say, I'm completely biased here, but I would say MDMA and probably psilocybin secondarily. So MDMA for PTSD and a whole variety of different indications for psilocybin, from end-of-life anxiety to depression to addiction issues. So because the researchers have been generating all this facts, it's being reflected in the media, and hence the psychedelic renaissance has been exploding across North America and Europe. So clinics, back to your question, so what clinics have looked like have essentially been research centers, multi-site clinical trials, and they've been spread throughout. Now, the advantage of that is staff have been trained all over the place to provide these services in different cities across North America, which has been quite wonderful because now we have these skill sets that we can build on to actually move into the next step. So while MDMA and psilocybin have been discussed in the media, the actual one that people are using most commonly is ketamine. And the history of ketamine is it was used as a dissociative anesthetic to allow surgeons to do relatively safe anesthesia. And by dissociative, I mean you leave your body as opposed to becoming completely unconscious. And surgeons would find they would want to talk to their knee surgery patient the following day about their knee. And then the patient would say, and I'm not depressed anymore. And the surgeon would go, huh, really? And would note it, but not do anything about it because they're a surgeon and they're not interested in depression. And that would happen repetitively till the surgeons got together and said, you know, this is a repetitive theme here. I'm finding this. Are you as well? And the answer was yes. So research started on ketamine, and it was found to be useful for depression. And so the allowed it, and I have a focus here. My focus is BC, so I know that it's been different across different provinces, but the differences are nuances, not massive. But within BC, they said, the College of Physicians and Surgeons said, yes, you can use this, you can use ketamine in the context of severe depression in hospitals. And they did that for a while, and they did research on that, and yes, it worked remarkably. And then astutely, somebody observed that they were using about 1/5 of the dose of an anesthetic dose. So if you're using such a tiny dose, why do you need it to be in a hospital setting? Good question to ask. And so the college asked that question and said, okay, you can use this in the context of community clinics. Now, the actual document that the college produced, I found fascinating, because they actually didn't use the word diagnosis. They used the word mental health conditions and chronic pain. And now I'm interpreting, but I believe that the term mental health conditions is larger than just specific diagnoses. They really want it to be available. And they didn't talk about level of severity. So that allowed BC to change, and I leapt into the opportunity to provide a psychedelic clinic. We now have 10 staff, and we're providing ketamine therapy for a variety of mental health conditions and chronic pain in the context of a community clinic. And that's what we're doing today. And I think that kind of reflects what's happening across the province as well.
Mm-hmm. And maybe then, thanks, Mark. I'll jump in because my background and experience lends to some more of the operational nuances. So I 100% agree with your synopsis, and also how ketamine, being the majority and the priority to focus on in these early days, is really the driver across the country. As you said, the College of Physicians and Surgeons in BC produced a document prior to the framework emerging in Alberta. So did the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta. The same group in Saskatchewan took that approach. We do have national guidelines, our CATA guidelines, our Ketamine Assisted Therapy Association put those out. And I believe in all of these, it was that attempt, Mark, to say, how do we now, through what we've observed, increase access? What I'll point out, though, across the country, to my knowledge, is there's different application of this type of treatment. And some will be outside of the combination of therapy. So you will have clinics that are provider prescriber led, that are just there to give the molecule or the medicine. And when I do this, I'm framing it around ketamine, as Mark had said. And then you will have clinics that have also combined the foundation of therapy within their program and ketamine together. There is variation across the country in that. So I think there's a good opportunity here as we come together and learn as to how do and what is required around licensing for those two types of care delivery, because some of it has been happening, as Mark said, for years and years and years outside of any clinical trial setting or potentially framework. And I do know some of our East Coast colleagues are looking, but have struggled to really understand, how do you get a program or a service where you combine and have the foundational piece being therapy with the medicine or the molecule versus having them separated? Because currently right now, as the college is that guidance and has produced those documents, that's the providers or prescribers that are offering the programming that we see. So there's variation across. It is majority being ketamine as, I'll use the term standalone, or a real robust ketamine assisted therapy program.
So building on what Verdi just said is what you see, what Verdi just said is reflected in the literature. There are really two streams of literature. There's ketamine by itself and ketamine in the context of therapy. And there's pros and cons to both. If you're simply thinking about access and you want the cheapest possible model, you just give people the substance and nothing else. Now, I know a fair number of people who've been through that experience, and every one of them has said it is completely bizarre not to be prepared for this profound experience and then not have the opportunity to discuss it with anybody. So the scenario, honestly, the worst case scenario is somebody shows up at an Emerge hospital, says the word, "I'm suicidal." They're wheeled off into a corner of a busy waiting room. They're hooked up to an IV drip without any discussion. They're given enough ketamine to blow them into the stratosphere. And then they come back completely disoriented and befuddled and confused as to what just happened. A nurse leans down at them and says, "Are you ready to go home now?" The word yes somehow is blurted out, and they go home and go, "What the heck just happened?" And yes, even that, what sounds like an appalling condition, does help. Now, I personally have a strong opinion. I think meeting with a therapist, dealing with your issues, setting up a whole series of practices that you have, things like meditation and relaxation techniques, to allow you to navigate this space skillfully, and then having a very nurturing experience as you're given the medicine, and then coming back the next day to talk about how important it was and debrief the process, either by yourself or with a group that you're with, is a much more powerful experience.
And it seems there's a lot of research to support that as well, too. And
Yes.
which leads to what's happening with the three experts on our panel and many in our audience is the preponderance of interest and activity and investment and curiosity about psychedelic assisted therapy and clinics. You've talked a lot about ketamine so far, but we also
Jake, before we leap on, could I just throw one more thought out?
Of course.
So I was raised or matured through the MDMA world, because I was involved with MAPS Canada, and MDMA therapy was what we were doing consistently. So I was slightly taken aback when I started running a ketamine clinic, because that was the legal door that was open, at how well it worked specifically for staff training. I hadn't anticipated quite frankly, to be completely blunt, ketamine is a lot easier to work with. It's very short acting. It's a disassociative. So when you give it to somebody, they're not present. Nobody's running around the room and nobody's engaging with you with intense feelings. And then it winds down and there's this reflective state you really work with people in. That's a lot easier than MDMA. MDMA is beautiful, but it requires a different level of staff skill. So I'm in the position of training staff to run this clinic. And if I was going to do it all again, I would start with ketamine, because ketamine is, quite frankly, so easy. And once you've got staff really, really competent and skilled working with ketamine, then move on to the other ones, but start with ketamine.
And I'll just maybe add, Mark, I appreciate that because my fondness and passion is in supporting interdisciplinary teams. So as you think about the safest, easiest, and most controlled way to bring those interdisciplinary teams together, have them learn together, I think you're absolutely correct. Ketamine is where you start. And then as you have access and you build on the other types of program and treatment modalities, your team is already adjusting and understanding more about their roles, their responsibilities, how they connect, and how that interplay really supports the outcome of the client. So I just want to add that in terms of the context of the clinic, interdisciplinary is where I'm focused. And I really appreciate what you said about where you start with orientation and training.
I mean, it's curious because MAPS hires therapists, Compass in the UK hires nurses, and I hired half and half. And I'm used to working with therapists, and to be honest with you, I'm not used to working with nurses. I really appreciate nurses.
Thank you.
For many reasons. The ideal team for me now is half and half, for many reasons. I mean, and just a slight tangent, but nurses are hardwired to work in teams. That is woven into their fabric of their personalities. So, and they bring this very pragmatic approach that I really, really appreciate. So nurses combined with therapists, I think was an unexpected bonus when we put the clinic together. And I would recommend that for anybody who wants to do this is 50% nurses, 50% therapists is the ideal combination.
I 100% agree.
Yeah. And I'm a therapist and you're a nurse.
Yes.
And so we're embodying that right here in this webinar.
It's true.
And we've talked a lot about ketamine and did mention MDMA a little bit in comparison, but there are some things happening regarding MDMA, both in Canada and the United States, as it affects clinical psychedelic assisted therapy. Does one of you maybe want to just give a slight icing on our cake, a little update on how MDMA is expected to change things in the near future?
Well, yes. And there's a question mark with that. So what's happened in the States is MAPS USA has gone through stage 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, which is what you need to do to bring a drug to market to make it available through a doctor's prescription pad. They've now submitted their data to the FDA. And then MAPS bifurcated. And they split into 2 organizations. And they now have a public benefit corporation and MAPS, and there's a name for the public benefit corporation that is escaping me, that it's a company that is responsible for marketing MDMA. So they'll be selling MDMA to Americans for sure, and when Health Canada opens the door in Canada, they'll be selling to Canadians through the doctor's prescription pad. The question that I actually don't have, and I was busily texting Rick Doblin trying to get the answer, who runs MAPS USA, is historically they've always said that they will only sell MDMA because a doctor prescribes it, but it has to come from somewhere. So it has to comes from a pharmaceutical company that will be run by MAPS. And they have said that they will only sell to therapists that have been trained and supervised by them, which is wonderful for the guardrails and to protect this and to keep the train on the track. But it's challenging because it's easy to scale up the therapy, but it's really hard to scale up the supervision. So to what extent that still applies now that this new company has been formed to sell it is a little unclear to me, and we need to find out. And then we need to have that discussion as to whether or not what's the training required before you can provide the service, because the expectation is this will happen this year, towards the end of 2024.
All of which just amplifies which may be the root statement of this webinar. It's just so complicated. It's just very complicated. And so what has been the progress more specifically with regulation in Canada, not just with MDMA, but with clinical therapies, perhaps with other medicines? Where do we stand now? Where are the laws progressing in Canada?
So maybe I can jump in just off Mark's statement, because I think many of us have heard about the Senate subcommittee's report. And so I think specifically still in Canada, we're in research and clinical trial mode when we think about that federally. So that's a Senate subcommittee report around specifically veterans in need and the opportunity for them to be supported and participate in psychedelic assisted therapy. I think, as Mark said, focused on MDMA was, I think, the biggest news in the last quarter of last year from a regulatory perspective. But I say that still within that lane of clinical trial. I do know, as Alberta has provincially now taken that step to put in its framework, I think it's readying, and other provinces or other jurisdictions look to the left or to the right to understand and see what's going on. To date, we haven't heard, keeping my ear to the ground or to the ceiling, that other provinces are actively engaged in developing their own framework. But I do know, based on the relationships I'm afforded, those conversations are occurring, but nothing tangible to this point, Jay. I think the biggest is that recent Senate subcommittee report, to my knowledge, and again, focused on MDMA-assisted therapy as what we will see, probably following some of what Mark's just described as the US path to that legalization.
And let me just add, in case someone in our audience, I'll give you hold for 1 sec, Mark. People may not know about the Senate report. Let me just say that was it November, October last year, the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee issued a report that strongly recommended that the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Defense, the National Institute of Health Research, and I guess the Ministry of Veteran Affairs invest heavily in researching psychedelic medicines to assist with the mental illnesses of veterans, because it said specifically a much higher number of veterans are taking their lives. And so that was a report that the Senate put forward at the end of last year. Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to build on what you have just said and what Reverdy also said. I mean, I found that report both exciting and positive, and quite frankly, fairly puzzling. Because yes, we know that veterans are injured often. The excitement of the proposal that you go off and fight wars and it's going to be a wonderful, exciting experience isn't true. Often veterans come back traumatized and suicidal. And so, and it's really hard to help. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is really, really difficult to treat. And so they wrote this report saying psychedelics could be helpful. And then the rather bizarre end of it was more research is needed. And the truth of the matter is, more research is not needed. That research has been done. I don't know if they didn't know that or they just avoided that, but MAPS USA had veteran-specific sites. And they demonstrated very clearly that veterans are, like everybody else, helped dramatically by MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So they shouldn't have said more research is needed. What they should have said is, this is coming down the pipe this year, hopefully, if Health Canada opens the door to the American process, because the Americans will legalize it. Does Health Canada open the door? So their first recommendation should have been Health Canada needs to lockstep with the FDA, and when the door opens in the United States, it should equally open in Canada. That should have been their first step. And their second recommendation should have been, how do we get therapists up to speed now across Canada to support this therapy and get them the training that they need from MAPS and get them the supervision they need from MAPS, so when it is available, we can open clinics everywhere. And they didn't. They said more research is needed. Wrong. More research is not needed. Training, supervision, and open doors to veterans is what is needed.
Great.
small steps and big steps, and still complicated and confusing and varying by province, as you mentioned earlier, the physicians, the colleges of physicians and surgeons are provincial, the federal government regulate the medicines themselves. And so in the context of tonight, what does this vast and complicated and geographically varying soup mean for clinics? What infrastructure do we need to put into place? How do we get the services to patients?
It's a big question, Jay. So I think currently right now, as we alluded to, there's a lot of variation. So I think it's understanding what some core components might be that would be helpful to share and spread and collaborate in. And when I say that, I think that because it's a natural coming together, as Mark and I have alluded to, what I would say that interdisciplinary team, or those classically working in health and those working in the community, I do think there's learning to be had there around processes and approaches, as Mark said, orientation. What does it mean? And is there a difference in capturing health information, or what rules govern some of those providers, those regulated providers that might be supporting your clinic? So I think when we talk about infrastructure, I don't believe we want to have a whole bunch more bricks and mortar, because we just talked about there's a lot of bricks and mortar clinics out there. What we would like to do, or I would like to do, is see how we can help support a knowledge and understanding, and even fill the gaps that some of those clinics might have in their understanding of how you bring team members together to offer these types of programs and services. And I think if we start there, what we always have, I think, a shortage of is a workforce. And often we try to maybe steal, or there's competition. And that's actually not what we want to do. We want to build up their expertise, their knowledge, and then we want to have that in a way that allows not competition, but people to participate in offering that access. And so training is a really important component of that. As Mark said, having clinics that have that interdisciplinary model, and understanding some of those processes and policies and procedures, that the frameworks that the governments will be putting in place potentially down the road would be required to have. So it's just a little bit of a high level about what might help and what might be we could start to do to be able to grow that momentum and that understanding.
And for those who are sitting on the sidelines, wondering if they'd like to open a clinic somewhere, I'd like to comment. So I'd be thinking about three things. I'd be thinking about licensing, and licensing can be both for the clinic or for your staff. We have nurses that are licensed by the College of Nurses. We have therapists that are licensed, they're RCCs, registered clinical counselors. There's a number of different licensing bodies that apply to therapists. There's CCC, Canadian Clinical Counselors. So there's that level of licensing. Then there's regulatory compliance, which means you're doing things within the context of what the College of Physicians and Surgeons says you're supposed to do it within. And then there's a whole other level, and it's called accreditation. So I've been through that process. The accreditation process I went through was called CARF, C-A-R-F. And it was a remarkable process to go through. You had to absolutely document everything. And then you like everything. It's like, where are the fire extinguishers? And do the staff know where the fire extinguishers are? And how do they know where the fire extinguishers are? And are you discussing that agenda item in a meeting? And is that reflected every 6 months in your staff meeting that you walk around and show people the fire extinguishers? And the level of detail that was required was completely outrageous. I mean, it produced a beautifully documented clinic. And so, and I think that's important. In the world of psychedelics, the horse is not fully, or the train is not fully, let's use a train analogy here, is not fully charging down the track. It's pulling out of the station. And so we need to keep the train on the track. And one of the ways of keeping the train on track is complying with these kind of accreditation organizations that will come in and just do an amazing job of making sure that you have every possible thing that you do documented meticulously. And one of the concerns that they had in advance was there can't be any wet ink, is what they said. You can't just document and then show them the manual. It has to be a living document where you're continuously reflecting on your practices and your training staff, and then retraining them and keeping their training up to date, and then documenting how you're doing that. And it's everything. It's everything from how you present yourself to the world, how you assess, how you screen, how you prepare, how you offer the medicine, what are your exclusionary criterias, everything, and then how you integrate and what you do when things go wrong, what happens if it works, what happens when it doesn't work, are there any health issues that you're managing? Absolutely everything has to be meticulously documented and then reviewed by these accreditation committees. Honestly, it's an extremely difficult process to go through, but what you get is a very, very robust, strong clinic that can withstand any degree of audit or oversight and challenges. It makes you bomb-proof if you do that kind of process. And I'd strongly recommend people who are thinking of opening clinics of engaging with an accreditation standard, a healthcare accreditation standard organization. There's a number of them out there. I don't have a particular recommendation of any particular one, but they're all similar in their level of detail and meticulousness in what you'll get as a product at the end.
So I would agree, and I think maybe this is leading us into our next question about some of the recent developments in Alberta. But I also just want to add to Mark's comment that this is where the beauty of that interdisciplinary team and bringing healthcare providers together with therapists, because I think there are all different kinds of practitioners who would like to open clinics or are currently running clinics. Often in the healthcare space, it's that team or the RN team that has had that knowledge, as Mark said, has had to go through all of the pounds and piles of paperwork that are required to ensure safe care. But I like what you said, to have a bulletproof or bomb-proof approach to how you run your clinic. So I do think that's also the beauty of bringing those teams together, because they share that knowledge. And what some may feel is very overwhelming, others may feel, oh, that's the way I've always done it, kind of my day-to-day business. The last thing I would say is that forms a really strong foundation for quality improvement. And a really big part of that is, how do we continue to build upon what we're learning and improve that in the clinical encounter or in operations? And I think as the service of psychedelic assisted therapy rolls out across the country and we have more trained providers and professionals, quality is going to be important, and how we continue to improve on what we do in the clinical encounter is just as important as the license or the accreditation stamp that we'll get.
And as you referenced earlier, Reverend, when you first started talking, there will be inspections and audits. So not only the mild, deep collection of paper that Mark talked about and the procedures and the mapping out of the fire extinguisher, but then people will be popping in to make you prove that it's not just wet ink on paper, as Mark had suggested. And as we've talked about earlier, of course, it does change depending on in which province you sit. And Alberta has been the first province to step forward with some regulations, which is where you're operating, Reverend, at Cena Life. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what actually is happening in Alberta at the moment.
For sure. So, and this is specific to accreditation. So often those two things, well, not often, they most always are separate. You have licensing on one hand and you have accreditation on the other. In the province of Alberta, you will have programs that are currently deemed to require accreditation. And often those programs have certain nuances of higher risk, potentially more complicated and complex clients. And so the colleges identify that these are the types of programs and service that would benefit the most from having more of that structure. And so in Alberta, it was interesting, and I don't know if it was always known and transparent, but the act that came into place with those service standards also required the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta, through an amendment in their bylaws, to have the psychedelic drug treatment service accredited. So for it to be an accredited program. There are a handful of others in Alberta that require accreditation, but that is not the norm, just to be clear to everybody. If you run a general practice, accreditation is something you strive to, but it's not a requirement. Psychedelic drug therapy and drug treatment services, it's a requirement that you must be accredited. So that news just came our way at the end of last year as well. And I believe it was only 3 months ago that the college identified they were now accepting registration for accreditation. And so in that, what you do, just at a very high level and a few details, is you do submit to the college your intent to be accredited. As Mark said, they will open up a portal and have you upload all of those documents, processes, policies, the types of things that they require to be part of that, which they'll share with you. And this process can be overwhelming. So it's not something that just happens quickly. It usually takes several months to unfold. And then there will be another visit. So not by an inspector, but by an auditor. So an auditor from the college, usually it's a peer. And here in Alberta, we have a requirement for a medical director to be a psychiatrist, and also other medical professionals that are part of the clinics that we operate. So they're usually a peer or another of the same provider that comes in to do that audit. And in that audit, they will review those things. And as Mark said, meet with your staff. So at Sina Life, we've submitted that request to be audited. We're in the process now of uploading our reams and reams of information for our quality management system so that we can prepare and participate in that audit visit. So we anticipate that probably in the springtime here, not till April, for any of the clinics that we have under our emerging license here in Alberta. So that's just a little bit of the detail, but that's a requirement in Alberta.
So, thank you, Reverdy. This is one of those areas of information where the more you learn, the more your head spins. Maybe I should personalize that and say the more I learn, the more my head spins. And the more information you get, the more questions you have. And so Vu, Atma is in the process of offering to help sort this out for people, offering to help them get information, help them get closer to being able to have a psychedelic assisted therapy clinic. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you're doing that.
Sure. Well, I was able to do it because of the expertise that Reverdy and her team has on Alberta regulations, and of course, the healthcare industry all together. So they're very crucial to our vision of what we want to help people with in terms of creating a clinic network across Canada. What we don't want is a lot of overbuilding. Rather, we'd like to use existing capacity, whether you're a psychiatric clinic or a psychology clinic that wishes to adopt this treatment. But at the beginning, we really wanted to have practitioners access. We know that there's a shortage of practitioners since COVID and even before that. And to get enough participation in this industry, you have to have enough participant to be trained and interested. And we had hoped that that was the first, I would say, bottleneck that we wanted to solve. And then, of course, as we work through getting closer to licensing and regulatory compliance, we know that the vast majority of therapists don't work as independent or in smaller practices, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 clinicians. They'll lack a lot of resources and even a lot of expertise or knowledge of the healthcare system to be able to set up this treatment in their clinic. So how can they access this kind of like a regulated or authorized facility so that they can still take their patient through psychedelic assisted therapy while using a facility that's set up for them, that's accessible to them. So the clinic network was set up to help accessibility for practitioners who have patients that can't set up their own treatment facility. And in getting more practitioners involved that way, and the practitioner can see that they have accessibility to clinics that are near them, they might be more inclined to take training, more inclined to be involved, more inclined to be participating versus being, I guess, distraught or disappointed that they can't participate. There's a handful of clinics in all of Canada, and even if this blows up with all the regulatory compliance that you need to do, we don't see that there's going to be enough clinics or accessibility for thousands of therapists who wish to participate and is needed in this field. And then, of course, the second piece is also just as important, which is patient accessibility. Our goal is to be able to find like-minded, aligned practices across Canada. Every population center from 50,000 up, we think, could provide accessibility. That's not the same for every population of 50,000 up, but we think that there's many of them that could support an accessibility hub, so we say, for therapists around there to be able to have access, but also so that patients from Sarnia doesn't have to drive all the way to Toronto to get treatment. And then the third is, there are a lot of clinics that want to adopt this. Since we haven't really launched this, and we've had to talk to about 20 plus practices across Canada, from BC all the way to Ontario, that's very interested. And I think there's a big benefit to us supporting one clinic to be licensed and be a service hub for practitioners in that service area. And in doing so, I think that we're using capacity that's already there, and we're helping that clinic have a long-term feasible practice and partnership with us as we increase their ability to be sustainable and profitable in doing what they want to do and their vision. There's a lot of tech, as you said, it's very complicated, and there's a lot of technical pieces to this. So for that technical piece, I'll hand it over to Rev, and she could provide a little bit of a roadmap of how we start talking to these practices that wish to become part of the clinic network, and what the process is for us to assess where they're at, what their visions are, and how we bring them on board to become part of the clinic network.
So I won't take very long, because I do know we have some questions there, but I'll just add a few pieces to what Boo said. The one other goal, and I think really value add opportunity for those that are part of a network of clinics, would be to share learnings. So talked about quality improvement and quality management, but as we just heard earlier, there's such variation. As we start to learn a little bit from each of those practitioners and clinics about their experience, what's going on. And I say this from a program and data perspective, which is different from an individual clinical trial health data perspective. So as we start to share that, I think there's huge value in being able to adjust your practice and learn about your programming and learn about the efficiencies or the challenges that can come up when you have an interdisciplinary team, or when you're trying to incorporate those types into the programs that are being offered. So I just wanted to share that as well, because that was a really big opportunity that I saw in participating and building a national network. And to Boo's point about what are the next steps, really our goal is to give people a sense of being empowered to make a decision about how they'd like to move forward. It isn't coming in and identifying a specific program or a specific way of doing it. It's to actually walk along and, as Vu said, have a brief discussion or an assessment about what are some of the things they've thought about in moving forward with either just starting to introduce psychedelic drug treatment into their clinic, ketamine being the first, is which of course is legal and we encourage. And what does that look like for not only the investment, the type of staff, the time that they need to get themselves ready for that regulation sometime in the future that may come to their province once we've legalized this in Canada. So that assessment interview is about 90 minutes, and we spend time walking through several key areas to identify a little bit of where that clinic's at. We'll then support that with a summary of that discussion so that they feel empowered to better understand kind of what their next steps can be. And as part of that, we encourage membership in that network so that we can work at the pace that is most suitable for them, and also to increase and start to build awareness about these hubs in these either lower or higher density population areas, where we can increase access to those practitioners who have been trained, are getting trained, and have clientele that they are struggling to know, where do I refer or how do I provide them access to a service that they're looking for and actively seeking out. So I think that's just a teaser about some of those next steps, but it really is the principle to empower the individuals that are there to make good choices about the feasibility of them moving into that next step. And then how do we support each other as a network to be able to raise all boats and get us to that stage of step and phase of licensing in the future when it may come to a province near you.
Let
And
me
I'll
give you an
just add,
example of why what Reverdy said can be beneficial for everybody. I'm a bit of a drug policy guy. I really am interested in the big picture and changing this across Canada and, quite frankly, across the world, making psychedelics more available specifically. So here's one example of the truth of Reverdy's words. If clinics across Canada all use the same screening tools and assessment tools and, various depression scales and PTSD scales, if we all use the same ones, then that would be data that could be fed into a large central database that would be incredibly useful for research. So some future researcher could say, MDMA done this way or psilocybin done this way in these series of clinics has this outcome. And the power of many clinics combining their data is absolutely huge. It makes it predictable. And it basically says, if you run a clinic, this is what you can expect in terms of your outcomes. And you can't do that if we're all using different scales. But if we all use the same scales, we collectively have the power to make a difference, both to other people that want to run clinics, but also to the federal government and to the general population who say, does this stuff work? And I think science actually can bring something to persuade the public that policy changes need to happen.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as we are talking to a lot of practices across Canada, I think one of the leading laggers, things that we need to consider first, is actually therapist and practitioner training. We do have a large pool of trained practitioners, but 700 spread across Canada is barely a drop in the bucket. And we have so few physician practitioners that are interested in this field to be able to provide the accessibility that's in our vision. So without shamelessly plugging, I think training, if you're hoping to be part of a clinic that wants to be regulated or authorized to deliver psychedelic assisted therapy, start thinking about taking your training now. Or if you're an independent practitioner who knows that there is one of our clinic members opening up in your small town, your big city near you, and you want to practice with them. Training is mandatory in Alberta guidelines for all practitioners in a licensed clinic. And that's the one piece that we want, that's non-negotiable for us in our clinic network, is that you must be trained, have some training. So that's one of the the more one of the things that you have to think more ahead than actually setting up the clinic itself to get that many practitioner trained in your clinic.
And as an employer, I see it from a different angle. So when I post, I'd like to hire a nurse, I'd like to hire a psychedelic therapist, I get a lot of applicants. It's very exciting. So when I'm looking at a pile of applicants, what I want is somebody who is accountable to a college, a nurse who's registered, a therapist who's registered, but also if they don't know anything about psychedelics, they're not helpful to me. And many people are getting things like the Atma training these days. So I have people that showing up as potential staff that have lists of training they've done and they're credentialed. Now, quite frankly, that makes my job easy. You know, it means that the amount of work that I have to put into a potential staff member is way less than if I'm training them from scratch. So I want people who have had Atma training, and I want nurses who are credentialed, and then we can just dive right into, you know, the bar is high then, and I can just fire them in and, you know, show them the paperwork and explain, you know, what are our particular policies and procedures. But it's really, really a quick entrance into actually doing the work in my clinic, and quite frankly, it's more efficient for us.
Agree.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Reverdy, and thank you, Vu. I think that there was a lot of information put out there. There's a lot of questions raised, but I think what we've also painted for people interested is some meaningful and tangible first steps. So if I can ask the panelists, if people are curious and want to explore this more further, is there a website or an email address or something you can put in the chat that people can reach out to get more information or find out what they can do or what their first steps might be? And then we do have some time for questions. Let me just say to our audience members, if you could please put your questions, there's a Q&A box for questions that's separate from the chat box. It's hard for me to pull the questions out of chat because there's so much dialogue in there. So if you did put a question in the chat, please repost it to the Q&A box if you haven't. We have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get through them. Keep your fingers crossed. I'll go through them in order. And let me just open that up now, and I'll put the questions out to all panelists, whomever wishes to answer. The first question says, hello, and thank you for holding this webinar. It's from Ali. As a registered nurse in Alberta, I graduated in April 2023. How could I become involved in working in a psychedelic assisted therapy clinic? I am currently taking the Atma advanced course as well.
So I think that one's probably over to us, Vu. So definitely we have a process where we reach on out to us, and we'll have a chat in regards to what your interests are, what it is that you're looking for, what clinics might be available and currently either hiring or are looking to have additional team members. And then that's our job. We'll make those connections based on what you're looking for, and we can go from there.
Thank you. The next question is actually for me. I think it's for the PAC. Where does the PAC fit? And I'll answer that quickly because our panelists have lots of important things to say. The PAC is sort of the umbrella organization. We're an educational organization. At the top level, we educate lawmakers and government officials on what's happening, what they need to know, and how they can put the best laws in place. We educate members of the psychedelic space for the purpose of harm reduction and ethical procedures and the right protocols. And also we have members across the country who get educated in webinars such as this. And because people from across Canada, nurses and therapists and people with Indigenous traditions and business people and researchers and scientists and doctors are all part of the PAC, we connect a lot of people. We help a lot of people get together with the other people who can help them move forward collectively. And you can find all this at our website where there's a lot of these resources posted. And thank you for that question. And we'll now move on to the next question, which is for our panelists again. This is from Diane. And she said, do you anticipate an opportunity for unlicensed guides or non-medical professionals who have been trained by institutes like Atma to work alongside medical professionals in offering these treatments?
Can I jump into that one? The short answer is yes, specifically because we always work in teams. So we need to have one licensed professional as part of the team. But for example, we can take on students. And so we haven't yet, but I love students. I think they're wonderful. I mean, they're enthusiastic, they're bright, they're engaged, and they're very motivated to do the work. So a student, by definition, is unlicensed. So we can take on students so long as they're always in the room with a licensed professional.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just maybe add, Mark, our specific clinical model has a role that we've identified as the compassionate witness. So it is an individual who has interest, training, and would be participating in aspects of that program. And to your point, Mark, alongside a registered professional. So we have a dedicated role for that in the programming that we provide as well.
Thank you. Here's one from Nikki. Is there a sense of when MDMA and psilocybin will be added to the list of allowed psychedelics for clinics to offer clients? Have the feds made any signals about this?
The short answer is no. We're hoping they do lockstep with the FDA. By the feds, I mean Health Canada. And I would really like to see when MDMA becomes available in the States, that Health Canada sees that and opens the door equally, but they have not commented that they will comply with that at all. Now there's a slight sidebar to this, because the special access program allows medicines to be available parallel to a clinical trial process. And that door is open in Canada. And the leader, the director of that program, I chatted to him once and asked him a very specific question, because my observation is there's not a lot of restriction when you apply for special access to MDMA. Like specifically, you don't need MAPS training, which I found quite puzzling. And I said, will that train that's now trugging down that track of the special access program influence what happens when MDMA becomes available through the doctor's prescription pad? And he was very, very clear. He said, no, that's a different process. And that's essentially structured by MAPS. And the nuance there, it's structured by MAPS until the generics can kick in. And it's either 5 or 7 years, depending on whether you talk about Canada or the United States. But 5 to 7 years later, it'll be a very different ballgame, because it won't be controlled anymore by MAPS USA. It'll be then the generics will kick in and they'll sell it any way they want to sell it. So we have different windows of opportunity that will change over time.
Thanks. In Alberta, do clinics that get absorbed under or partner with one eventually licensed provider also have to independently apply for a license and independently apply to be accredited?
I'll answer that one. So the application process identifies multiple location or facilities can actually occur under one license. So if you have an organization that you partner with and they add you to their license, then everything that they do, not only their license requirements, but everything they do for accreditation, all those policies, they must apply to that second location. So the answer is no, you wouldn't need to get your own license and your own accreditation if you were under the umbrella of a group that has identified and listed you as one of their facility locations. But that group would have to apply by all of those processes, policies, rules, approaches that organization that's supporting them and offering them. I almost think of it as like an umbrella or an extension over their clinic.
Thanks.
Can I quickly answer the question, just because my brain is there? Can a person with a bachelor degree in psychology who has done the Atma training work as a psychedelic psychotherapist, or do they need to be a registered psychologist? I actually don't hire registered psychologists. Quite frankly, they're too expensive. And that makes the service less available. And so I hire in my clinic RCCs, registered clinical counselors. And that's at the bachelor level often. I mean, it doesn't matter to me what level they got the RCC, so long as they got the RCC. So we don't actually hire any registered clinical psychologists.
And maybe I'll offer the same perspective from the Alberta lens. The regulations require you to have a registered psychologist. And as Mark said, that sometimes can be a challenge. What I do know is there's an opportunity here because in Alberta, the clinical counselor has been advocating, and an entire group was ready, I think probably 4 or 5 years ago, to move into a regulatory space. So create a college for the counselors, just like there's a college for registered psychologists. That was put on hold. I'm not 100% sure all the nuance and the reasons behind that. But currently in Alberta, you must hire a registered psychologist to participate. And as you said, Mark, it's challenging because the economics around that impact accessibility for clients right now and what their benefits are covering, how they get that covered, and how they can participate. So that's a little bit of a nuance from the Alberta landscape.
Thank you. Is the panel aware of any plans for training to be offered for Ontario specifically, similar to Atma? Also, is there any insight into why Alberta has been the province seemingly in the lead for pushing this area of training forward and not elsewhere like Ontario, excluding BC with Maps Canada located there?
So I can answer the training. Atma training is Canada-wide, and we do have clinics opening in Toronto and London for in-person training in 2024. So wherever you are in Ontario, the Atma program is available to you. I will leave Rev to the rest of the question.
Yeah, as I probably said, I'm not too sure what Alberta thinks when it puts forward some of its bold decisions around, I would say, the emerging and upcoming innovation or the opportunity to impact and influence health. So my sense is, just based on the government's mandate and some of what the people want, these are the things that have been put forward. I can't honestly say there was any negative thing that happened or any positive thing that happened that led to their decision to put the psychedelic drug treatment service standards in place.
Thank you. And let me just add that on the Psychedelic Association of Canada website, there is a list of training courses, which I'm going to put in the chat right now. And if you go there, that will list a lot of people and organizations who offer training. So that might also help you find some training. You mentioned about Atma training for becoming a psychedelic assisted therapist. Do they have to be a registered psychologist as well? What other registrations do professionals have to become psychedelic assisted therapists beside the Atma training?
Well, the simple answer for me is the nurses are registered as nurses, RNs, and the therapists are registered as RCC, registered clinical counselors. I could make a case for CCC, Canadian Clinical Counselors, so long as they have a body that they're accountable to.
And I don't know if it's specifically around training, but I do believe training is open to anybody who's interested in taking that. It's just a matter of where do you apply that skill set and how does that fit after your training is completed. So when you talk about not being regulated or registered, as we alluded to in that previous question, there are roles in certain clinics for unregulated providers, as long as they're accompanied by a regulated provider as part of that programming. So I would say that anybody could take that training who has an interest and a passion. And then I think it would be as part of the clinic, how do you fit into a role there, specifically for direct patient care or not, depending on what you're looking at. And I think, Mark, you might allude to different areas of wellness and alternative therapy that are also adjunct to what we see in psychedelic drug treatment service that I think many other non-regulated professionals contribute to some of the great outcomes and benefits for people seeking help for their mental health.
A slightly tangential aside is, in my world of maps, what was generally what I observed and was agreed by many of the people who are running the show is when people came with high degree of credentialing, psychiatrists with many years of work, with psychologists who have been doing it forever. There's both a learning process, but there's also an unlearning process. because you don't want people doing their normal shtick at a client who's experiencing a psychedelic. And the unlearning, I think, is more difficult than the learning. And so we're very careful. We're in this the assumption of all of this conversation is credentialing is a good thing. And I just like to observe credentialing can actually be a problem. And when I'm looking to hire staff, yes, we have to do the credentialing thing to keep the train on the track. But what I'm looking for when I'm interviewing somebody is, to be completely honest, is a huge, compassionate, grounded presence. I want to feel warm and included by how they talk to me during the job interview. I want to feel enveloped by their connection skills. I want to feel that I'm safe in their presence. That's what I'm looking for when I'm hiring staff members.
Thank you. Here is another question on qualifications of a different sort. What need is there for people who are business and administrative experience versus medical?
So I'll jump in, because as you think about the nuance of merging health into community practice, I think I've shared that prior, we do need individuals supporting all aspects of a client's care. So when we think about business or administrative, there's often roles at the front desk. There's roles behind the scenes. You could have roles for quality. All of those types of roles make a well-rounded clinic function well and also evolve. So I do think there's a need for those types of roles, specifically in the clinic that I run. Yes, a front facing reception. Sometimes the name would be medical office assistant. We do have a quality individual that supports us, as I alluded to, all of that paperwork that has gone on for accreditation. And I think that there is also leadership opportunities in that. Sometimes it is difficult because you're not regulated, but I think you have all those qualities. And I really like what Mark said about being just a well-rounded, compassionate individual who's passionate about the space. There's lots of other opportunities I think, for individuals who are interested within this space.
And often a potential client's first experience of a clinic is the person who answers the phone. And it's so important. I mean, if I think about myself, and put myself in the position of a client, I've been struggling with this thing, be it PTSD or depression or anxiety, for years and years and years. And I haven't been able to summon up the courage to make the phone call. And eventually I make the phone call and I'm so anxious, I'm so ready to burst into tears, and I say help in one way or another. And the response from the receptionist is crucial in that moment. Do I feel supported, understood, connected, and informed appropriately with my questions, even if my voice is quavering a little bit? The skill of a receptionist is huge when they're doing it well. It's not a simple task. And I adore our receptionists because they're so good at what they do. And I watch them engage people, and I'm just in awe of that particular skill set. You know, we talk about receptionists and it doesn't seem complicated. It's complicated, and it's skillful to do it well.
Do you think the overabundance of regulations in Alberta around psychedelics reducing access will drive a portion of the industry underground?
Very good question. I'll jump in just with a few of my thoughts. I do think underground exists. I don't know if it's more or less than it ever has been. And I do think there's groups that are striving towards regulation. I do believe that the Alberta regulations are stringent. And I do believe there has to be a balance of safety and access. So in that, I did advocate and reach out, and I'm worried that Alberta isn't evolving. And I think they're just getting their feet under them for, as we talked about, the inspectors to come for the licensing and the accreditation. But I do think there is a window that they have purposefully left open for evolution and change with how strict and complicated their current regulations are. This is my personal opinion. So yes, I do think there's always a risk that you limit access in favor of safety, and there's a balance between those. I do think underground does exist, and maybe that leads us to a bit of our conversation around harm reduction, but I'll just say I don't know if it's more or less. I think that where we're going and what we see as some of the opportunity allows us to come together to support above ground, but also to be there because we do realize accessibility is a big issue.
I mean, I'd like to comment as well, is yes, the underground world works and exists, and it will continue to exist. It's not going to go anywhere. And there are some fabulous underground therapists. And there are some terrible underground therapists. And if you want to complain about your underground therapist, and there is no vehicle for complaints, our whole system has a problem. That's one of the advantages of above ground, is there are vehicles to complaint, and there's a transparency around people's behavior. So, and also underground has insurance, or can have insurance. So if there's a problem, there can be compensation through insurance companies that doesn't happen in the underground. So yes.
Thanks. And you know, the psychedelic space in many ways for the mainstream society is so new that it's learning and growing, and our lawmakers and our governing bodies are also learning, and maybe some of the first steps may not be perfect or maybe right, but as Reverdy said, there's room for improvement and room for learning, and you know, even a tiny step forward is a step forward. There were many questions about specific qualifications to be therapists. I think we may have answered those in the content of our conversation. They may have subsequently been answered to when you posted your question. If they weren't, perhaps you can click on the email that was in the chat and ask your question specifically. That's it for the questions. So thank you all. I think it's been a fascinating look into a complicated area of a growing and important area of healthcare. I think it's always a great relief to me to see how many informed experts we have out there making sense of this and leading the way. Oh, did we just get another question? That's a really long multiple question, and we only have a few minutes left. I'm sorry, I'd like to answer it. It's just such a big question. I don't think I'll have time. And so thank you, panelists. It's been illuminating, as they say. It's been helpful, I know, to a lot of people in the audience. I can tell because of the questions that they asked and what you answered. And so thank you for that. I'd like to thank the PAC volunteers. The PAC has 1.75 staff and a whole army of talented, capable, professional, knowledgeable volunteers who do things like producing these webinars, the behind the scenes people, the marketing people. Everything you saw created tonight was created by PAC volunteers. So thank you to the volunteers. I'd like to also thank Vu and Atma, because Atma sponsored this webinar as part of our Industry Speak series. Thank you, Vu, for the work you're doing at Atma, for believing in the mission of the PAC, for being a leader in the psychedelic space and moving us all forward. It's greatly appreciated. For those of you who are in the audience, you've had a taste of what the PAC does. We provide information for all sorts of interested people, including lawmakers. Our mission is to get legal psychedelic access for all Canadians. And so you can join the PAC. We have hundreds and hundreds of members across the country. Your membership fee helps us move our mission forward and also gives you access to great events like this and opportunities to meet other people like yourself across the country. I can put the membership link in the chat for you now. So click on that link, check us out, see what we offer you there, and I will look forward to seeing you at subsequent events, because the other thing we do at the PAC is we have a lot of fun. So join us. Thank you for joining us tonight. I don't know, panelists, is there anything else you'd like to say before we bid farewell to our audience?
Jay, your leadership is noticed and appreciated. Thank you for being our national leader.
Well,
Thank you so much, Jay.
Thank you, Jay.
I do it for selfish reasons. I have great fun at it. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you all for coming. Check out our other events on our website. There's all sorts of things going on that website. It's a pleasure at the PAC to be able to provide events like this to all of you and to bring you together for this. Panelists, I've learned a lot tonight, and I think I filled more brain cells with answers than I did with questions at the end of the day. So thank you all very much. And I look forward to seeing you again and seeing everyone in the audience at the next webinar.
Take
Thank you.
care. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.